Welcome to the Finance Marketing Podcast, a show that empowers finance professionals to market their businesses in ways that feel good and actually achieve results. I'm your host, Hillary. I've been working with folks in financial services to develop marketing strategies that work and create results-oriented marketing content since 2020. And I've learned a lot about what works in finance marketing, what doesn't work, and where financial services pros get stuck. Join us each Friday as we explore real, effective ways to market your finance business and connect with folks who truly embody your ideal clients. My guest this week is Sean Mullaney, and this is actually Sean's second time joining me on the Finance Marketing Podcast. Sean is a financial planner with an advice-only practice in Los Angeles. He focuses on those nearing an early retirement by conventional standards, and Sean was actually my very first guest when I launched this podcast, so it feels quite special to have him back to talk about what he's learned in the 2 years since our last conversation. I cannot believe that this podcast is 2 years old. So in our first episode together, we discussed Sean's first book on solo 401ks, and now he has just released his second book, this time co-authored with financial advisor Cody Garrett. And the marketing lessons he's learned between those two projects are pretty valuable. So in this conversation, Sean gets really refreshingly honest about the mistakes he made with his first book, particularly around writing it before he had true clarity on his ideal client. And he shares a really powerful question that every advisor should ask themselves before investing time in a major project like a book. And the question is, will this be successful even if I don't sell a single copy? We also dive into how his second book has been even more successful because of the years he spent building relationships and credibility in the financial planning community, which is just a really helpful reminder that effective marketing is often about playing the long game rather than looking for quick, immediate wins. So if you've ever considered writing a book or creating a really major piece of content that requires either a significant time or monetary investment or both, or you're struggling to figure out your niche and ideal client, this conversation kind of fulfills all three of those things. It's going to give you some really practical insights into how these pieces need to align for your marketing to have a real impact on moving your business forward. So without further ado, let's dive in. And Sean, thank you so much for joining me today on this episode of the Finance Marketing Podcast. I am delighted to have you back. How are you?
Hillary, I am doing well. Thanks so much for having me back. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
I am too. It's going to be really fun to do kind of a follow-up. If you haven't listened to Sean's episode before, you totally should. It's actually the first episode that ever came out of the Finance Marketing Podcast. So thank you so much to Sean for trusting me that this wasn't going to be just like I'm going to try this podcast and we'll see if it works out or not. So in our last episode, Sean, we talked a lot about your first book that came out. And in this episode, a year and a half later, you have a second book that just came out. So I'd kind of like to talk about lessons learned along the way, what the two books have done for you and your business, regrets you have, regrets you don't have, and all of that fun stuff. So do we want to just dive in? Can we just get a quick recap of the first book that you wrote and why you wrote that book?
Sure. So the first book I wrote is called Solo 401k, the Solopreneur's Retirement Account. It came out in September, October 2022. So it's about 3 years old now. It's still out there on Amazon. People still buy it to this day. And I started that project in early 2021. And at the time, I was a much newer advisor. I hadn't been in the business for 2 years when I started writing that book. And I wrote that book in part because I saw a need, meaning solo 401ks, self-employment, solopreneurship. It was a growing, burgeoning area and still is, frankly. And there has not been, amazingly enough, in the personal finance content, enough ink spilled about solo 401ks. So it was like, okay, I have one myself. I'm interested in it. And it felt like there was a gap in the amount of coverage. So it felt very natural to me. And I also tend to like writing. So that's another piece of it. Now, what happened over the almost 2 years of writing that book, and it wasn't writing the whole time, there were delays, there were stops and starts for various reasons, but sort of my practice evolved, and it evolved away from the direction of solopreneurs being my ideal client. So it was interesting. That book came out and my practice was going in a different direction. So there was a misalignment between that book and my marketing for my practice. And that is what it is. I'm proud that I wrote that book. I think that book does have a lot of value, but it's also from a book perspective, swimming upstream. People identify much more with the job they do, not that they're a solopreneur. And so if you look, things that are targeted for solopreneurs tend not to be as popular. And so that book, and I learned a lot of lessons from that book. It was some really good reps in terms of finding my own voice as an author. It was good reps in terms of just learning the book process. But ultimately, if I had to do it again, I probably wouldn't do that book because of the misalignment between where that book was and where my practice is now, which is much more focused on those 0 to 5 years out from an early retirement by conventional standards.
Interesting. So do you almost feel like because you wrote it so early on in your practice, you hadn't gotten a sense of the ideal client that you actually like to serve yet?
I think that's true, Hillary. And I will say, books are not the go-to marketing tactic. They just aren't. Now, that doesn't mean books can't be very successful. And we could talk about the second book that I co-wrote with Cody Garrett that right now I believe to be very successful for a number of reasons. But yeah, I'd been blogging for 2 years when I started writing that book. And so it was sort of a natural progression and evolution. And, I think what I over focused on was my own perception that there had not been enough content around solo 401ks. That was true. Frankly, it's still true today, but it's got to align with the marketing. I think one lesson I sort of learned is if you're going to write a book as an advisor, you got to ask a question. Is this book going to be a success if I don't sell a single copy? Because I think that's revelatory. If you can write a book that will be for your practice a success if you don't sell a single copy, that's a bit of an indication that you might want to consider it. Now, books have time, expense, right? So it's not a slam dunk. But there are some books that, from a credibility perspective, from a visibility perspective, could be a success even if you didn't sell a single copy. And nonfiction, by the way, books are a tough way to make money. As that's another issue with books. So you want to ask that question: is this book could this book be a success even if I don't sell a single copy?
Did you ask yourself that question when you wrote the first book?
100% I did not. So look, the first book did have benefits that I get to this day. I'm not here to say it was a total failure or anything like that. It did establish some credibility in certain audiences, and that's good. It did, help me get a few clients in my practice. But again, my practice and my ideal client was going away from that. So it was never that impactful from a client perspective, but it certainly helped get, a small handful of clients. Yeah, it's something that you get with some hindsight and having gone through the process. It was, so I'm glad I wrote the book, but from a marketing perspective in particular, it just was not that big of a success.
Okay, I love that. So before we move on to your next book, one final question about this one. Knowing that you're glad you wrote the book, there was some benefit from it. If you could go back, what would you do differently?
Well, you know what I would have done differently? I would have identified my ideal client. That's what I would have done differently. And I think that would have led me to the conclusion that this was not a project I should have done. Back then, I was only 2 years in, not even. And so there was still an aspect of my practice of the right clients, any client that walks in the door.
Yes.
And now I wasn't exactly there, but I was way too broad. And I would hear at conferences, oh, the riches are in the niches and you got to niche down. And mentally I'd be resisting it. And it was true. Now, that doesn't mean like, oh, my only clients are 57-year-old dentists who are going to retire in 2 years, right? You don't have to niche down that deeply, but you got to have some sort of an idea and it's got to align with pricing, with service model and ideal type of client. And that did not come into focus for me until really and only in the last 2 or 3 years in my practice. It just took me a time. And look, I'm a career changer. So maybe some of that time was just spent, honing my craft, learning technical stuff, learning how to work with clients. When we start off as career changers, there's a lot to learn. and I lagged a little bit on some of the marketing side. I did some good things on the marketing side. I built credibility with my marketing. I got clients with my marketing. I got reps with my marketing. I built knowledge through, some of that content creation really helps build your knowledge. So, there were certainly good things about my marketing, but there were drawbacks. And the big drawback was that I didn't, or the cause of the biggest cause of marketing problems was that I didn't identify that ideal client earlier in my journey as a financial planner.
Yeah, a couple things I want to say here. I think another positive, I mean, I met you at a conference because you were on a stage speaking about this topic and you had your book in hand. And I imagine that the book is the reason that you were able to get on stages so early in this career change for you.
No, that's a fair point. Absolutely. And I will say this. So I've been blogging now. It's called FItaxGuy.com. No ads. So at least it doesn't, it's not going to kill your browser. But I've been blogging. It's almost 7 years it's something like seven. I think it's almost about 7 years now, give or take. I may have been thanked, a small handful of times for 7 years of blogging. The book Cody and I just wrote, I was at a conference last week and a couple of people walked up. Thank you for writing this book. And, books have a level of credibility and influence. Now, it's tougher to get out to the world, right? Because a blog or a YouTube video can just go right up and everybody has almost no cost of entry versus a book. You got to go on Amazon. You got to whip out your credit card. But the depth of the contribution and the appreciation is much deeper. And so that is an argument for writing books.
Okay. One final question about this process with the first book, and then we will get to the second book, which I'm so excited to talk about. So you mentioned, your practice was shifting away. You were getting more focus on who your ideal client actually was. When I look at solo 401ks for solopreneurs, I think a lot of advisors would say, well, that is a niche, right? So what was the problem with that niche? Was it too broad? Was it not a profitable niche? I just want a little clarity there for anyone who's listening.
It's almost all of the above. So one thing with solopreneurs is they don't identify as solopreneurs, right? People identify as I'm a financial planner, I'm a gardener, I'm a plumber, right? So few people are saying, hey, I'm a solopreneur, so I got to research retirement for solopreneurs. It's out there, it exists, but it's just not a great way of communicating with the end user where the end user is. So that's one piece of it. And I will say, I find just in serving those who are 0 to 5 years out from retirement, it's a better fit for what I like to advise around. It's a better fit, even generationally, right? So I'm a Gen Xer. I'm a late Gen Xer, but I'm a Gen Xer. So, those thinking about retirement by conventional standards, I'm closer to in terms of retirement versus the solopreneur who could use a solo 401k to build up a big balance. They're going to be more in their 30s, maybe early 40s. The folks I'm relating with better, just a lived experience, how do we work together, tend to be more the Gen Xers. So that's your late 40s to your early 60s. So that's just sort of how it all evolved and why that book was not as good of a fit for what I'm trying to do in my practice.
I remember in our last episode, you mentioned that you had clients pay a flat fee versus because that's kind of what that niche at the time really wanted. Have you shifted since then, now that you're working with these people who are closer to retirement and have assets that need that?
No, I've not shifted. So, my firm model is advice only and project based. So it's advice only. And what I mostly focus on, not exclusively, but mostly through my firm, is initial financial plans. And it's generally a 90-day planning process. Now, folks can come back later for a revised financial plan or for a more discrete engagement called fourth quarter tax planning, where we're measuring for things in retirement, things like charitable contributions at year end, Roth conversions, end of year distribution planning, estimated payments, tax withholding, that sort of thing. So so that's sort of where, and that model, what I find is there's a lot of folks who have done pretty well financially, but they're getting close to the retirement decision and they don't have a full-fledged plan, and they got all sorts of questions on drawdown because nobody learned in high school how you draw down a retirement portfolio.
Right.
So these are folks with wealth, spread out, right? Traditional retirement accounts, taxable accounts, some Roth, but they're folks who are essentially, near a decision, and they're seeing the other side and they're saying, wait a minute, I have no training. I have no background on how I do that other side. So maybe now, a few years out, is the time to at least put in place, well, this is generally what we're going to do on that other side. And that's where my interests and their needs sort of intersect nicely. And so that's where I spend a lot of my time now, which, that's I think a great niche because it's folks who have a decision, folks who, can afford financial planning and have real planning needs. And those needs are not met by their previous background, their previous experience. And even a lot of the content that's out there doesn't focus on, well, here's sort of the ideal or somewhat ideal drawdown tactics and strategies. And so that's why, I think it sort of works for me and my interests and client needs. So that's why I'm fond of that niche now.
I love that. It's so unique, and it sounds like you've tapped into a really interesting market. So let's get to the next book now. I'm done kind of grilling you on the solo 401k book. Tell us about the next the book that just came out with Cody Garrett.
Thanks for asking about it. Always happy to talk about it. So it's called Tax Planning to and Through Early Retirement. It is 350 pages or so, give or take. And we talk about accumulation and tactics for building up wealth during your working years. And then we've got a lot about drawdown tactics, order of operations, Roth conversions, something called the premium tax credit, which matters for early retirees, all sorts of stuff, tax gain harvesting, tax loss harvesting, looking at the different phases of retirement. And, one of the reasons I think this book, if we don't sell a single copy, and by the way, we've sold some copies, so that's good news. But even if we didn't sell a single copy, this is branding me around two terms. One, tax planning, which is a big focus of mine and an interest for potential clients. And two, early retirement. And like I said, my ideal client is someone who's thinking about an early retirement, at least by conventional standards. We define that as before Medicare enrollment, which is the month you turn age 65. And so again, going back to that idea of, well, if we didn't sell a single copy, could this be a success? Yes, because it's branding me around tax planning and around early retirement. That's what I'm looking for in clients and client needs. So that's just a great combination. Now, yes, Cody and I are both very interested in these issues, and we're looking to move the needle in terms of public perception, right? We think that a lot of the content in this space has been somewhat misguided. And by the way, the world has changed in the last few years in a way that very much supports our preferred planning approach. So we are looking to move the needle. It's more than just a marketing device, much more. I mean, way too much work went into it. It's too deep to just be, a marketing device. And I don't mean that as a pejorative, by the way, but it certainly has a secondary goal of trying to move public perception in terms of some of this retirement planning and tax planning. But like I said, it still could be successful even if we didn't sell a single copy because it's branding me. And I don't want to speak for my co-author, but I presume Cody would get some benefit about being branded around tax planning to and through early retirement as well. So that's a big part of the reason why this book's marketing profile, I think, is a lot stronger for somebody like me.
Absolutely. Talk to me a little bit about the decision to co-author rather than to author this completely by yourself, because I can see that there may be some pros and cons to that as well.
Oh, 100%. And so it's funny, you look back at a decision-making process and you're like, yeah, I was right about X and Y and Z, and I was wrong about A. So I was generally right around a few things. One, this is very aligned with my niche, and so that's really good. Two, there'd be a lot of interest in it. And three, having a co-author who I was aligned with would be helpful. And that was something too. I think sometimes as financial planners in this new world of we all work from home behind our screen or our WeWork office, it is good to align and just to know other financial planners, because this was the sort of book that I could not have co-written with many other people, even if they had extensive tax knowledge. I had to have a co-author that was fundamentally aligned, big picture with me, right? Not that Cody and I agree on every last thing, but we had this alignment, and I knew that we had this alignment because I had have such a good relationship with Cody, and and have engaged with him. So that is like a bit of a, it's great that we have clients and we have these computer screens, but once in a blue moon, you ought to at least, interface and network and just connect with some of your fellow financial planners. But so I was mostly right that there'd be interest. It was well aligned with my niche, and it would be very helpful to have a co-author for a number of reasons, including different marketing strengths that we both have, right? We have different relationships. We have different strengths and weaknesses when it comes to marketing. Cody happens to be very good at some of the marketing that I just am not, especially on the social media piece. So there's that. Now, I sort of mentally, before going into this project, was like, well, you have a co-author, so you just have to write half, and he'll write the other half, and so isn't that easy? Well, that wasn't really true, because, okay, so yeah, I write my half, and it's never going to be 50-50, right? Because, I'm going to go on, one of my chapters is going to be bigger, and one of his chapters is going to be bigger, and he's going to add some stuff. I'm going to add some stuff. But that's what we're getting to. Because, all right, Cody writes his share. Well, now I have to go edit that, review it, make sure I agree, disagree, so it's not 50-50, regardless of whether you're going to do more than half the work. Both of you, right? Essentially, both of you are doing more than half the work because you have to. Because not like, oh, we just throw this chapter in. No, you read each other. You make sure the chapter, the book flows. We changed our table of contents a number of times while we were writing the book. We had this initial, here's the table of contents. Here's the initial split. You're going to do this chapter. I'm going to do that chapter. But then as we did it, it was like, wait a minute, this chapter should be 2 chapters, or we should add a chapter on this topic, or we should add a chapter on that topic. So even the table of contents was a little fluid while we were working on the book.
I imagine. Well, and I actually have a slightly similar experience. When I was in grad school, I wrote a lot of collaborative research papers with co-authors. And it really does feel like it's more like each person is doing 75% of the work rather than 50.
That's right. That's a good way of putting it.
But I always felt, and maybe you felt this way too, that through the process of co-authoring something, the end product is so much more valuable, and there's so many more things in there than either of you would have been able to come up with if you had both written a separate book about the same topic.
Oh, 100%. So a few things on that. Absolutely. It helped to have both of us organizing our thoughts, and both of us learned as we did this. I know that's so true for me. I don't want to speak for Cody, but as I was writing my parts, I was like, wait a minute, what about this? And we got to include that. And, I had new insights, new thoughts about this. Part of me said, hey, this is essentially a marketing effort in some ways, but it was also a development effort. I'm a better advisor for having written this, co-written this book with Cody, 100%. And so, it's funny when you do a book like this, you do step back from some of your client work, and that has pros and cons, and more cons in terms of revenue and whatnot. But there are, it was almost like, hey, I'm going to prepay marketing and development and education, right? So in 2025, vis-a-vis other years of my practice, I'm going to be more focused on marketing and, development and education versus maybe 2026 or 2024, where maybe I was a little more client focused, and that's fine too. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right that maybe 75% is a pretty good way of thinking about it.
Right. And that's an interesting perspective as well, is to look at it as 2024 revenue was a certain level, 2025 maybe revenue isn't as high, and this is why, and that's intentional, and nobody needs to feel bad about that. Because you mentioned before we hit record, you don't use ghostwriters. A lot of advisors, I think, and that's a viable route for a lot of advisors if they want to use ghostwriters to help them get a book out for marketing. That's fine. But you guys do not. And writing a book is an endeavor. So how did you and Cody, knowing you were going to be co-authors, how did you set expectations for each other on this is probably how much time we are going to be committing to writing this book?
Great question. We did start with the end in mind. So, so there was a big current event that was very impactful in terms of this book, and it was the passage of the tax bill.
Mm.
And our perception was that a tax bill was likely to pass, and it was likely to pass this summer, but it was not guaranteed. It was not 100% guaranteed. Now, as we moved through the year, it got more and more guaranteed. So that very much helped. And it helped us that it was passed July 4th. At one point, it looked like it might slip into August. And so, we looked at the calendar and we thought late September. Why? One, because there would still be interest in the 2025 tax bill. But then two, people could start folding in, you could buy this book and actually incorporate it into your year-end planning. It would have been a little odd to release this thing very late in the year, because then it's like, it's just a tough time to get people's attention, and it's a tax book. So very late in the year for Christmas wouldn't have been so good. And then if it was going to come out in 2026, we would have had to hold it up to get the 2026 tax numbers. So it was sort of this confluence of, can we get this thing out in late September or early October? And then that just sort of says, okay, this is when we got to have things done. And now we were working. So the tax bill it was like, okay, they're going to probably pass a tax bill. There were a lot of chapters we could write without worrying about the tax bill. We sort of knew like things like tax gain harvesting, tax loss harvesting, rollovers or retirement accounts, planning for the early withdrawal penalty. There were certain technical issues that it did not look like the tax bill was going to touch, and basically it didn't. So we could have those in the hopper, and we could have other things in the hopper. So when the first draft of the tax bill came out, it wasn't like, oh, we now have to rewrite this book. It's like, no, we plug this in, we plug that in. And, fortunately, when, for us, right, I'm not making a political statement, but I'm making a statement about writing a book. Basically, in May, the first version came out, and what ultimately passed was very thematically aligned with what came out in May, but we did have to change some numbers. There was one number we had to change for literally $250, but it's like, look, you can't have an example that's $250 off. Right. So it was a little more annoying than anything else, but it wasn't like, oh my goodness, we got to rewrite this book because the Senate version is so much different from the House version. So that was just sort of a accident of history that benefited us. And yeah, so it was, and I will say it was a lot of work. And my model essentially, when I work with clients, it's project based. So I took on less projects. And so, yeah, the revenue did decline. There's no doubt about that. But like, we talked about earlier, there's going to be some benefits in the future, I think, from having, taken this time to work on this book.
Absolutely. Well, final thing I want to ask you about, Sean, is let's talk about marketing a book, because you can't just write a book, put it up on Amazon, and assume people are going to know about it. What did you guys do to start building some interest and buzz around your upcoming launch, which ended up being in September?
Yes. So Cody was great with an email list and social media posts. That was like that was prong one, where it was like, we start posting that, hey, we're doing this. We're talking about this topic or that topic. And I would do some of this too, but Cody was really the leader, on that piece of it. And he built this email list so that you could sign up for an announcement of when the book was going to be launched. And that was very successful. That, and Cody's really good about the social media and generating buzz on LinkedIn, Facebook. So that was the first piece of it. The second piece of it was leveraging our networks. So, reaching out to podcast hosts we know and other folks we know, where, hey, we could get on podcasts to market the book. We've already been on some, and I actually compiled the list in October and November. We've got some recordings lined up too. So that's a big piece of it, is just a lot of the, it's a combination of social media, leveraging relationships with podcasters. So we're going to be on a lot of podcasts. We've already been on some. We're going to be on others. Chris Mamula from the Can I Retire Now blog, he did a great review of the book. So like, we're like all these different, sources where, hey, somebody could be talking about our book favorably. So that's been I think sort of the main thrust of it. And that's also another reason maybe to wait a little bit in your career to write a book, meaning, my relationship with other content creators, other financial planners 3 years ago is not what it is today. Same with Cody. So, we've both been, spending some years building relationships, being guests on podcasts in the past. And so I think we've built some credibility over the years. And so that is helpful. And you're absolutely right, Hillary. You just can't put a book up on Amazon and think it's going to sell. You've got to have ways of directing audience and getting attention. So yeah, there you go. I think it's just sometimes the answer is time, which is not the most satisfying answer, especially when you're a new advisor, but sometimes it's just build up relationships as you can.
Yeah, it feels so slow in the beginning, and it feels like every single action you take doesn't really mean anything. But as you said, 3 years ago versus today, it's totally different.
Well, and Hillary, you mentioned something, how we met at a conference. And I sort of think with conferences, no one conference is determinative of anybody's career. I mean, yes, in theory, maybe Joe Rogan shows up at this one conference and he's like, all right, I'm going to put you on my show and you're going to sell 1 million books, right? But no one conference is determinative of anybody's career. So Hillary, if you've got conference X is coming up, but your kid has something big, okay, you could skip it. But what happens with these conferences, they stack on top of each other. So yeah, maybe you miss 1 year, but if you go most years to, this conference, that conference, and a third conference, maybe you tend to form relationships at these things and they tend to stack on top of each other. And you tend to be a more effective attendee the third time you go. And then the fourth time and the fifth time, you sort of know the lay of the land. You know how to network better. You reconnect with people that maybe you don't run into every day, and you build relationships and strengthen relationships that way. So, yeah, I mean, I think some of it, whether it's conferences, whether it's podcasts, whether it's your own writing, your own YouTube channel, sometimes, right, wrong, or other, the answer is repetition and just being committed to it.
Absolutely. I mean, I just cannot agree with you enough. We met at FinCon. That's the conference we went to. I've been to FinCon in 2021, 2023, and 2025. Those 2 years that I missed is because I had babies. And so
and that's perfect. That's great.
Yes.
You don't have to go, oh no, Hillary didn't go to FinCon 2024. That's it for her practice.
Right.
No, not at all.
No.
But yeah, if you keep showing up, even if there's some gaps, it's going to ultimately probably pay off for you.
It was amazing to me this last time around in 2025, just a few weeks ago, how many people I knew and how many people knew me, mostly from the conference in 2023. 2021, it was a weird year for conferences anyways. Didn't really see a lot of the people I met there in 2023, but then from 2023 to 2025, it was amazing. So I agree with you, reps all the way. Sean, is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you think you would love for people to know about the book or the process or anything like that?
Well, so I'll say this: the book is one thing we haven't talked about in the content creation space is there used to be a dichotomy between there used to be a dichotomy between advisor facing content and layman facing content, meaning, so there'd be like, Journal of Financial Planning or whatever, and you'd be writing these highly technical articles that were only intended for other advisors. Or you've got your YouTube channel and you're doing your shorts and it's only for potential end users. It's only for the general public. And what we did with our book is we said, those lines are blurring, and they're blurring more and more. Think about like a big name in sort of personal finance and in content creation is Michael Kitces. Do only advisors read Michael Kitces? No. Do only laymen read Michael Kitces? No. Right? There's an opportunity in all of our content to speak to both advisors and to speak to end clients. And end clients, you got to look at your audience, but there are plenty of potential clients and end users and laymen who are very smart and very sophisticated. And now, yes, our book sort of builds up from some basic principles to some more advanced concepts. You can't just dive into, this is exactly what you should do in retirement. But I think there's a real opportunity to speak to the world as a whole, at least in the United States, versus, I'm going to only focus on advisor content, or I'm only going to focus on end user content. And don't be afraid to be a little more sophisticated. End users can understand it. Now, you set yourself up for some comments sometimes, but that's okay. You don't have to worry about the critical comments too much. So that's just like one other piece of advice that, sometimes people are looking to build up credibility. So maybe I'll only write for an advisor-based audience, and that will still build up my credibility. I just think like those days are disappearing, right? We're writing for the world, and now you got to make sure the world includes, to a significant degree, your niche client, right? I'm not going to be writing about, I'm trying to think of I generally don't write, say, about the child tax credit. Well, that's for younger parents. It's a great tax rule and it's important, but I tend not to write about that because that's not where my niche, client is. So alignment with the niche client, but also don't worry about, I can only write for advisors, or I can only write for end clients.
I think that's such a great piece to end on, Sean. If people want to learn more about you or the book and Cody, where are the best places for them to do that?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Hillary. I really appreciate it. So my internet home is FItaxGuy.com, and it's a blog that also has links to the book, to my financial planning practice, and you get my bio and my blog articles, my YouTube channel. So that's the best place there. And then the book is on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. We are trying to get it into some libraries through some help with some of our network. And, we do know that at least one person, reached out to their local bookstore and said, hey, can you order this for me? And they did, and they got it. So there are some possibilities with bookstores, but, mostly the book is going to be online. That's just the nature of books today. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, I believe it's on Walmart.com and other online booksellers.
Fabulous. Well, I will include all those links in the show notes. Thank you so much, Sean, for coming on and sharing so much in depth, from when we talked a year and a half ago to today. This is really helpful.
Thanks so much, Hillary. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Finance Marketing Podcast. If you're eager to market your business in a way that feels good and actually gets results, sign up for the Finance Marketing Podcast newsletter in the show notes so you never miss another episode. If you liked what you heard today, please be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite listening app and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. We'll see you back here next Friday.